Hello and welcome to Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm your instructor Daniel Strada, and this is the lecture video for Lesson 3. In this lesson we're going to be talking about consequentialism and the Ford Pinto. Alright, let's get into the lesson. So as I said, we're talking about consequentialism and the Ford Pinto, so I want to introduce consequentialism as a theory. We'll also talk about the trolley problem, which you might know about. And then the centerpiece of this lesson is the Ford Pinto case. We'll talk about the details of the Pinto, and then we'll talk about this article from Mark Dowie that was published in Mother Jones in 1977, Pinto Madness. This is where Mark Dowie finds the so-called Pinto memo that demonstrates Ford's consequentialist reasoning in the safety of the Pinto. I have some other sort of philosophical resources that you might be interested in. I'll talk a little bit about Singer and tobacco, the tobacco industry. Okay, let's first just get into consequentialism. Consequentialism is an ethical theory, and it's a theory that holds that you can evaluate the rightness or wrongness, the goodness or badness of an action by looking at the consequences of that action. So consequentialism is the ethical theory that what ethics amounts to is looking at the consequences, and then you can evaluate whether something was right and wrong, or a good or bad decision, the correct decision, or however you want to put it. You can evaluate the ethical situation by looking at the consequences of some action. So this view goes by lots of different names. You might have done cost-benefit analysis. In a cost-benefit analysis, you're sort of weighing, you have a decision, you're weighing the costs of making a decision versus the benefits of making that decision. Maybe you have a couple different decisions, or a couple of different options, and so you sort of weigh the costs and benefits of each option against each other. In this case, what you're looking at are the consequences of your actions, and how much of those consequences are positive and how much of them are negative, and then you're sort of adding them all up. Weighing pros versus cons. Maybe some of you were deciding whether to go to NJIT or maybe some different school, or maybe go to NJIT and or get a job, something like this. You might weigh the pros and cons of these alternatives, right? There's weighing alternatives. The general maxim for consequentialism is trying to maximize the good. So when you're weighing these alternatives, you want to produce the best outcome by whatever measure you're using. And so consequentialism is, you might understand consequentialism under the catchphrase of maximizing the good. Before I get any deeper into this, I'll go ahead and say that consequentialism is the first of 3 ethical theories we're going to be talking about in class. This week we're doing consequentialism, which is about the good. And we have 2 other ethical theories. In Lesson 5, we're going to talk about deontology. Deontology is a fancy way of saying duty ethics. And so deontology is about doing what is right, or doing what you're obligated to do, or doing your duty. So deontology and consequentialism, they're not enemies. In fact, they often agree about different, what's right and wrong. And in most cases, they'll agree. But in some cases, they disagree, and this is because of this sort of different theoretical perspective. And then in Lesson 6, we'll go over the last ethical theory, virtue ethics. And on my little scheme here, if consequentialism is about doing what's good and deontology is about doing what's right, then virtue ethics is about doing what's best, which might be different in some ways from what's good and what's right. And again, these are sort of nuanced theoretical differences that might matter to a philosopher. It might not interest you at all. I sort of like the theory, and if you like theory, then feel free to talk about the theory. If you don't like the theory, though, the core of this lesson is going to be on the cases, and these theories are supposed to just be useful for doing some case analysis. So really the centerpiece is going to be on the cases and the details of the cases. So we can imagine a sort of generic consequentialism that just has the moral rule to do more good than bad. This doesn't really tell you much about what is good or what is bad, or how to evaluate things or weigh them against each other. But this is what the generic consequentialism wants. More specific versions of consequentialism will fill in more precisely what they mean by good and bad, and how to do the evaluation, how to do the cost-benefit analysis. So, for instance, a organization that operates on a profit motive, that what matters most is generating profit, and all of the concerns are subservient to the profit motive, right? So this is the kind of consequentialism. This is the kind of consequentialism that thinks that the consequences that matter are whether it is generating a profit or not, whether it's making money or losing money. And an organization might organize around a profit motive, might have that as its primary concern. businesses and corporations might have profit as a primary motive. And in these cases, this is a kind of consequentialist reasoning where you're worried about its consequences, but you're worried about these specific consequences. Other kinds of consequences, whether you're behaving ethically or whether you're behaving safely or in the public's interest or whatever. These other concerns for an organization is acting according to the profit motive. These other concerns are less important. So this is a kind of consequentialism. There are other kinds of consequentialism. Here's a different kind of consequentialism. Egoism, or sometimes called ethical egoism. The ethical egoist thinks that it's always your obligation to act in your own self-interest. Not just that people do, as a matter of fact, act in their self-interest, but even more strongly that they ought to act in their own self-interest. The ethical egoist thinks that people should look after themselves, and that if everyone looked after their own selves, the world would be a better place. The ethical egoist is sort of against altruism and helping others. The egoist thinks that helping others takes things away from yourself, and your primary obligation is to yourself. You should always act in your own self-interest, so you shouldn't help others unless it helps you. Only help others unless it's helping you first and foremost. Right? Never do things just out of the kindness of your heart, but do things for the sake of others. Right? So again, this is a kind of consequentialism. It's different from the profit motive, right? Profit motive organization might not act in its own self-interest. It might, burn profit really quickly and then collapse or whatever. But the egoist is acting in the self-interest. Okay. Here's another kind of consequentialism, radical environmentalism. A radical environmentalist might think that the environment is the most important resource we have, and that all actions in defense of the environment are justified. So the environmentalist isn't acting in their own self-interest. An environmentalist is acting in the interest of the environment, and they might think that it's justified, for instance, to block a whaling ship, or tie themselves to a tree, or release animals from a zoo or something. Right? These things are potentially illegal, potentially dangerous to humans, but they might be helpful to the environment, and so the environmentalists will do that thing. Right? So all of these views have some particular consequence that they're going for, and they're willing to sacrifice other values for the sake of that particular consequence. I think these are varieties of consequentialism. Here's another kind of consequentialism, Machiavellianism. In a sense, this is the sort of general version of the views that I've already talked about. Machiavellianism thinks that the ends justify the means. The Machiavellian thinks that doing... so the ends are your goals, and the means are the things that you do to accomplish your goals, or the resources that you have for accomplishing your goals. So the Machiavellian thinks that whatever accomplishes your goals is justified. The fact that they're your goals is what justifies them. So if you're late for work and you're driving to work and you have to cut someone off in order to make your exit, well, you have to make your exit, right? That's your goal, and so you're justified in cutting the person off. Or maybe causing a car crash. Maybe you cut the person off and they swerve and end up flipping over the side of the road. The Machiavellian thinks, well, as long as I get on to my meeting on time, the action was justified. Right? The Machiavellian doesn't care what you do. You can do things that are really bad or illegal, or morally bad by other considerations. But if it accomplishes your goal, then it's justified. Okay, these are all kinds of consequentialism. But the particular kind of consequentialism I want to focus on, and this is the popular view. Most of these views aren't terribly popular. Most people don't hold these views explicitly. The variety of consequentialism that is rather popular is utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is also a consequentialist view. It's a kind of consequentialism where the focus here is on utility or happiness. So utilitarian thinks that the goal that matters is the general happiness, and you should do whatever it takes to maximize the happiness. So there's a kind of means and reasoning here, but what matters is not self-interest, it's not profit or other kinds of specific consequences, but it's maximizing the general happiness. So I want to go over utilitarianism in a little bit more detail, but since I talked about Machiavellianism, I want to talk a little bit about the dark triad. So Machiavellianism, as a political theory, is the ends justify the means. But Machiavellianism is also a term in psychology, social psychology, sometimes business psychology. Machiavellianism is characterized by people who are manipulative, exploitative, people who exploit other people, who act in their own self-interest, and who have cynical disregard for morality, for others, for the interests of others. Right? If you think that it doesn't matter what people think, that you're going to do whatever the hell you want, you're going to manipulate people. This is a kind of Machiavellianism. So this is one branch of what's called the Dark Triad. The Dark Triad are these three personality traits that, when combined, make the sort of particularly aggressive and domineering personality that you often see in high power positions, in high power business and political positions. So as an example here, just to give a flavor of what's being talked about, I'm not at all accusing Lyndon Johnson of being Machiavellian or being an instance of the Dark Triad, but Lyndon Johnson, former President Lyndon Johnson, was known sort of infamously as being a close and aggressive talker when he's talking to you, and especially if he's trying to negotiate something with you or otherwise get you on his side. He will get right up in your face, talk to you. So Lyndon Johnson's also a very tall man. He's well over 6 feet tall, a very big man, and he was president. He was a very high-profile, high-powered politician, and when someone like that gets right up in your face to talk to you, it can be very intimidating. It can be very stressful, especially if these people, have your job on, can decide, to fire you, can decide your things about your career. This kind of behavior can be very intimidating, and there's a reason why people do it. Is because it works. Because it can get people to, it can convince people to, take your side or sign that check or whatever. So this kind of behavior, it might be an example maybe of manipulation or exploitation. I don't think it's an example of anything else on the list, really. Maybe antisocial behavior, but it's just an example of some of these things. But you can see how this kind of behavior can be effective in the business or political world. So when you combine this with things like a pure self-interest motive, when you combine this with cynical disregard for ethics, for the interests of others, and then also with narcissism. So the other branches are narcissism. Narcissism is sort of this inward-focused, self-obsessed, grandiosity, pride, egocentric, egotism, lack of empathy, lack of concern for how others feel. So Machiavellianism, narcissism, and then psychopathy. Psychopathy, or sociopathy, in clinical psychology, they call this antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial behavior, when you sort of don't care about the norms of appropriate behavior, you sort of do things impulsively. I just had the impulse of saying sports coaches can sometimes be like this, very manipulative, exploitative, and also sort of aggressively mean, maybe even antisocial. I don't know this from personal experience. This is just a stereotype, I guess. Impulsivity, selfishness, remorselessness, right? These are features of psychopathy. So if you get these three things together, it makes someone who is quite aggressively toxic to these environments, but at the same time is possibly very successful, possibly able to get a lot of people on their side working for them, possibly able to become president of the United States, for instance. But the theoretical focus for this lesson is on utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism. It's the kind of consequentialism that says you ought to maximize the good, and then gives a specific definition of what the good is. For the utilitarian, the good is utility, or maybe easier, just happiness. Happiness here, for the utilitarian, happiness means doing well or being well. Philosophers like to use the word flourishing, sort of flourishing like a garden flourishes, like a productive garden, right? There's a clear difference between when a garden is doing well, is productive, if it's a flower garden, if it's making flowers or whatever, and there's a clear difference between that and a garden that's dying, that's wilting and decaying. It's a scientific difference. It's a material difference in how that system is performing. And so the part of the idea of the consequentialist is that you can measure how well something is doing, how happy it is, and you can act in a way that maximizes happiness. not just for you, but for the maximize good in general. So happiness here, it should be clear, is also not pleasure, right? So the flourishing garden is not merely a happy garden. We might say it's a happy garden, but it's not just that it feels nice. You might be happy when you take a lot of drugs, but maybe you're not doing well. Maybe if you're a drug addict, you're not doing well. Maybe you feel good, but you're not doing well. You're not sort of flourishing, right? So the early utilitarians, like John Stuart Mill, were very clear that the principle of utility is not just about being happy. He says it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if a fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it's because they only know their side of the question. The other party of the comparison knows both sides. The idea is that it's better to be dissatisfied with better things than satisfied with sort of lower things. So happiness here isn't just sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's not just a hedonistic lifestyle. It's doing well in general. And again, the idea is that you can measure how well something is doing. It's like a scientific thing. You can measure it in the lab, and you can act in a way that maximizes happiness. And again, not just happiness for you, but happiness in general. Happiness, greatest happiness for the greatest number. Jeremy Bentham even went so far as suggesting that you could quantify happiness. He said 1 hedon is 1 unit of happiness, and he gave some criteria for measuring hedons. And so utilitarianism is the idea that we want to maximize hedons. You can evaluate for each action how much hedons one action versus another produces, or one choice versus another produces, and then act in such a way that you create the most hedons. And again, not just the most hedons for you, but the most hedons generally. There are some issues with utilitarianism. Sometimes it's hard to make decisions about what's coming. You don't always know the consequences of your actions. Sometimes you do something thinking that it will cause a lot of good, and it ends up causing a lot of bad. And in that case, the utilitarian is going to say, well, you did the wrong thing. Even if you thought it was going to be the right thing, even if things had gone the way you thought they'd gone, things would be better. But if they didn't go the way they thought you'd go, and things ended up worse, so the utilitarian is going to say that you're responsible for that action, that you did something wrong. So not knowing these consequences in advance makes it a little bit difficult. We can talk about this more as a theory, but the way that this is usually introduced in practice is with the trolley problem. I have a little video up here. You can watch the trolley problem, but since I'm on video, I'll just do the problem myself. So the original trolley problem is here you're standing at this intersection of these trolley tracks, trolleys on the track, and it's going down this straight track. And the thing is that if it keeps going down this track, it'll kill these 5 people. In this image, the 5 people are tied up. They don't need to be tied up, though. They're just sort of standing on the road. If they're tied up, you might worry about who tied them there, and maybe they're responsible. So ignore that they're tied up. Imagine they're just standing there, and they don't know the trolley's coming. They have their iPod earphones in or whatever, and so they don't know the trolley's coming, and they're just standing there unawares. And if you do nothing, the trolley's going to hit these 5 people and kill all 5 of them. But you happen to be standing right at this critical jump where there's a lever, and if you pull that lever, the trolley will be diverted onto the sidetrack and kill. So there's another person on this sidetrack, a person who wouldn't be hurt if the trolley just went on its normal course. But if you pull this lever, that person will also be killed, but these 5 people will be saved. And so the question is, do you pull the lever? So if you don't pull the lever, 5 people die, and 1 person is saved. But if you do pull the lever, then these 5 people are saved and only 1 person dies. Go ahead and think about what your response is. A lot of people enjoy thinking about what they would do. And part of the fun of the trolley problem is that you can sort of switch up the example so that things change, right? So what if, for instance, this one person is not just some random person, but what if it's your mom, right, or someone you care about, your grandma, and if the trolley goes down this track, they kill your grandma. So you might say, well, of course I'm not going to pull the trolley then. But maybe you were going to pull the trolley in the original case when it's a random person, but maybe you don't pull the trolley when it's your mom. And then the utilitarian is going to say, well, what's the difference here? So in both cases, one person dies versus 5 people dying. The only difference in this case is that you have a special relationship with that person. But if it's a random person, other people have a special relationship with that random person, or that random person is going to be someone's family member or friend, right? So no matter who dies, someone's going to get hurt. And when you save your mom over a random person, you're not just making sure that the total hedons are less, but you're really just trying to save hedons for yourself, right? You don't want to get hurt personally, right? You don't want to kill your mom, but you're willing to sacrifice someone else's mom. And so the utilitarian is going to say this is sort of unfair, that even if it's your mom, you should pull the lever, because the interest here is about total hedons, and presumably no matter who it is, the same number of hedons are going to be spent, and five hedons are 5 times as many as one hedon, or one person is going to result in X number of unhappy people, X number of hedons or negative hedons. So 5 people is going to be 5 times that number. And so just from a hedon analysis, just from the utilitarian analysis, you should pull that lever. And you can swap out your mom for someone like Gandhi, someone who's like saving a lot of lives, or you might also swap it out for someone like Hitler. If these are all serial killers, for instance, is it better to kill all 5 of them and save an innocent person's life? If these people are old versus young, you can if they're engineers versus managers, or you can come up with all sorts of variations of the same theme. One very popular variation is the so-called fat man. So in this variation, there's no sidetrack, and there's no lever. There's just this track, and the trolley's going to kill these 5 people. But there's a man who happens to be standing near the track. In this image, they're standing on a bridge, but they might just be standing near the track. But the key is that the man is a big man, a fat man, and he's just big enough that you, as an engineer, can calculate that if you throw him on the track, he will stop the trolley. The trolley will grind to a halt, sort of over his body, before it hits those other 5 people. And of course, the man is going to jump himself. You have to sort of push him on the track. You just push him with your bare hands. And so the question is, do you push the man onto the track to save the 5 people? And what's interesting is that a lot of people who say they would push the lever here say they won't push the man onto the track. So they'll pull the lever, but they won't push the man. And again, the utilitarian is going to say, well, what's really going on here? It's still one person dying versus one person dying. And in this case, it's not. You don't even have a special relationship with the person. The person is just a random person, or the only characteristic of the person is that they're fat. I sort of get uncomfortable with this example because it kind of trades on stigma against fat people. Maybe because he's bigger, you might think that it's less bad to push him or something like that. But the really important thing that people say is that the problem is the actual pushing. Like, you have to actually touch the person. And over here, you don't have to touch the person. You're sort of removed. You have this lever. And this is strange, right? The same from a consequentialist perspective, from a utilitarian perspective, the same number of people die in both cases. Right? You're still sacrificing a person. And the only difference is how involved with that person are you? Are you sort of far away and you're only sort of pulling a lever, or are you right up close and having to actually touch the person? So this is sometimes called in ethics the problem of distance. Right, the problem of distance is that how far away something is, how removed you are from a thing, from an action, or from the consequences of your actions. The less moral responsibility you feel for those actions. Right? If you're at the end of some long technological chain where you're only pulling a lever or pushing a button, maybe your relationship with the action and its consequences feels different from if you're right up the thick of the action. And this sort of matters for cases like military drones. Military drones are dropping bombs. The drones are in the war zone, but the pilots of the drones are on base in the United States. And that means that they're sometimes thousands of miles from the people that they're killing. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to automation and drones later on in the semester. Let me just read this quote from Peter Singer. I'll talk about Peter Singer a little bit more at the end of this lesson. Singer says, the fact that he is physically near us so that we have personal contact with him may make it more likely that we shall assist him. Singer here is talking about a case not where you push a man onto the track and kill him, but a case where the person is next to you and you help him, right? That we're more likely to give spare change to the person that we walk by on the subway than we are to give relief aid to people in countries where they're starving overseas. And the idea is just that person's close to us. That person's someone we're passing by. We have to actually see them and look them in the eye, versus someone who's overseas and we have very little interaction with them, and so we feel less responsible. And Singer says, well, look, the fact that someone's physically near us, so we might have personal contact with him, may make it more likely that we shall assist him, but it does not show that we ought to help him, rather than another person who happens to be farther away. If we accept any principle of impartiality, universalizability, equality, or whatever, we cannot discriminate against someone merely because he is far away from us, or we are far away from him. Right? The idea is that distance shouldn't make an ethical difference. Right? The person on the subway is just as hungry and feels the same kind of pain as someone on the other side of the planet, but we're more inclined to help the person near us than the person far away. And Singer says this is not a moral obligation. There's no moral difference between someone's pain, the pain someone feels, whether they're near us or far away. This is Singer's talking about helping, like famine relief, but as we saw with the trolley problem, this is a problem that's created just with technological distance. Just inserting a lever between you and the person that you're killing makes it a little bit easier to handle. Right? Just inserting a button between you and the person you're killing. Right, mediating technologies, and the further away you are in the technology, the more impact it might have. Right, so a good example of this is cyberbullying. So cyberbullying is sometimes described as the result of the online disinhibition effect. The online disinhibition effect, disinhibition. So inhibition is that you sort of stop yourself from doing things. If you're inhibited, you're stopping yourself. So disinhibition is you're not stopping yourself. And the idea is that things that we would stop ourselves from doing in person, we don't stop ourselves from doing online. Right? Like we say things that we wouldn't say to someone to their face, but we say it online. Well, why? Well, because you're far away and you feel like you're anonymous, like they don't know who you are, that they can't see you. If they can't see you, then it doesn't matter what you do, or you can do things that are more sort of extreme. Right? You're not doing it at the same time, you're doing it at a later time. So there's this sort of illusion that when it's mediated by technology, that it's sort of just a joke or just a game, or that the rules somehow don't apply if there's these big sort of technological mediation. And this is why you see in online interactions, especially among kids, you see bullying behavior quite frequently. This is a result of this technological distance, sort of breaking down the normal rules of evaluation. And again, as Singer says, the distance shouldn't matter, right? You shouldn't treat people mean just because they're on the internet. Like just the distance, the geographical differences, that shouldn't be what's making the difference. And we can think in an engineering ethics class, we can also think about the relationship between the designers or producers or manufacturers of some product or service, and then the consumers who use that product or service. Sometimes the designers might be very far removed. Sometimes manufacturers might be very far removed from the consumers, and vice versa. Sometimes all of these parties might be very far removed from the externalities, from the sort of additional consequences outside of what is being taken into account in the cost and benefit. Right? So externalities are additional consequences that you aren't explicitly taking into account. Sort of traditional example of an externality is something like greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. For a very long time, greenhouse gas emissions, it was just what cars did, and no one paid for the consequences to the environment. The producers of the cars weren't paying for it. The oil producers and manufacturers weren't paying for it. The consumers weren't paying for it. It was just being leaked out into the atmosphere. And that's a big problem. It's causing a bunch of environmental issues, and these externalities need to be taken into consideration, right? So part of the taxing of designers and consumers for environmental regulations is about taking these costs, these externalities into account. Right, so think about how responsible, right, so this goes both ways between both designers and consumers, and vice versa, between consumers and designers. Consumers often feel very distant and removed from the facts about design and production, so like how responsible do you feel for the actions of your country overseas, or the actions of the companies whose products and services you consume? Right, if my military is bombing a foreign country, how responsible am I for that? Given that they're wearing my flag and that I'm paying for the bombs, with my tax dollars. Or the company, the shoes that I wear, if they were made in a sweatshop overseas. I never see that sweatshop. It's not part of my experience. I just go to the mall and buy the shoes. But me buying those shoes is giving money to the company who's keeping people in perhaps unsafe working conditions. And then, how responsible are you for that? I don't have this on the slideshow, but maybe it's worth talking about Foxconn. If you know about Foxconn is a manufacturing company in China, one of the largest manufacturers in China, and they make just about every major electronics company uses them as a manufacturer, so almost all of Apple products, Google, Dell products, Sony products, Toshiba, right? Most of the electronics that you use are being manufactured, even by these different companies, are being manufactured by Foxconn, which is this large manufacturer in China. Now, these are all electronics, so you need clean conditions for electronics manufacturing. It can't be sweatshops. And if we here, let me. So here's a factory floor in one of these Foxconn factories. Lots of people, relatively clean conditions, but the working conditions, besides being clean, haven't always been very good, and the pay has been low. And in particular, you're working in these factories are sort of located out in the countryside. And you go out to the countryside to work at this factory job for sometimes months at a time. It's often the case that that you're staying at the factory or on the factory grounds, maybe in dorm rooms on the factory grounds. So you're going between two buildings on the same campus for 6 months or whatever as you're manufacturing all these products. A lot of these products are being manufactured for our Christmas shopping season. And then you're sending the money home to people, to people back in the city. So although the conditions were relatively clean, the pay and the other aspects of the conditions weren't so great. In 2010 and thereabouts, there were a rash of suicides, 18 suicides in the Foxconn plants. And what's characteristic about these suicides, and sort of like a movement, is that the people were throwing themselves off the building, sometimes near the same time period. May of 2010 was a bad period for this. And they're throwing themselves off the buildings in some sense to protest the bad working conditions. And Foxconn's response to this were to build suicide nets. So around the factories in their plants, they put these nets so that people jumping off the sides don't hit the ground but crash into these nets. So this was the working conditions. That's building all of the electronics that we use. Right, so if you're using electronics from any of these companies, which is most of us using electronics from some of these companies, then you're contributing to companies that are literally driving their workers to suicide, like mass suicide. Right, so how responsible are we for these conditions as consumers? Right, and how does the fact of distance between you and these consequences, or how does that matter? Another issue, just briefly, I want to mention is this this idea between doing and allowing harm. So in the trolley problem, a lot of people respond, well, look, if you just don't do anything, it's not really your fault that the other person dies, because you didn't do anything. If you just stood there and just didn't touch the lever, didn't do anything at all, then how can it be your fault you didn't do anything? And the response to this is to talk about this difference between doing and allowing harm. So maybe you didn't do anything directly, but through inaction, you allowed harm to happen that you could have easily prevented. Right, so if I see a baby drowning in a kiddie pool, and I'm right there and I could reach in the pool and save that kid, but instead I just sit there on my phone and play games on my phone or whatever, then when that kid dies, it's partly my responsibility, even though I didn't do anything to kill that kid, because in some sense I let the kid die, or I allowed the kid to die. Sometimes this difference is put in terms of killing and letting die, but it's not just about death, it's also about harms generally. Right? So allowing a harm to occur that you could have prevented might also be an example of a consequence of inaction. Okay. That's enough theory for right now. We're going to talk about the Ford Pinto case. I want to first set up a little bit of context for the case study. So Ford Pinto is a car that was built in the 70s, from the early 70s all the way for most of the decade. In the 70s, there were in the late 60s and early 70s, there were a lot of things happening in the automotive industry. The first big thing to talk about is that the cars at the time were just very unsafe. I like this video. This video is a frontal offset collision.
That's the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety's front crash of a 2009 Chevrolet Malibu and 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air. In slow motion, you can see the differences in how the new and classic cars perform in this version of the traditional frontal offset test. The Institute conducted this test to commemorate its 50th anniversary, and it dramatically shows how much improvement has been made in passenger protection since the nonprofit organization opened its doors. The two cars collide in an explosion of metal, glass, and plastics. Where the Malibu crumple zone absorbs much of the crash forces ahead of the windshield, the Bel Air structure allows the lighter car to compress the passenger compartment. The impact is made worse for the Bel Air driver by the lack of airbags, head restraint, and even a seat belt. As a result, injuries to the neck, chest, and both legs would be likely. Consequently, the Bel Air receives a poor rating across the board. On the other hand, the modern Malibu provides good protection, with the dummy movement being well controlled. Measures indicate a low risk to most body regions, though a foot injury would be possible. Beyond the safety gear, advancements in vehicle engineering give the Malibu a clear advantage in this matchup. While classic cars are often considered to be rock solid, this 59 demonstrates how much better today's cars are. And the IHS has played a key role in driving these advancements. In the past 50 years, the Institute has made a real impact. The roads today are safer for it.
Yeah, so
Head of the
cars at the time were unsafe. There's this sort of myth, this nostalgic myth that these cars were, or tanks that they were, built of steel that they could withstand anything. But in fact, they were just death traps. The steering column goes right into his face. Right? This guy's dead on this impact. No question. But the same thing doesn't happen for the Malibu. So these cars were unsafe. They had no safety features whatsoever. And in fact, they were designed for aesthetics, for the way they looked, and not for the way that they performed, especially from a safety perspective. Right? These fins, the dashboard in the car, right? The dashboard, right? There's nothing here designed for safety. It's just this bench seat designed to make out in. Right? The cars are not meant to protect people going 65 miles an hour on the road. So everyone knew it was unsafe, and in fact, vehicle deaths sort of spiked in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it became a public outrage, partly in response to this book published by Ralph Nader, Unsafe at Any Speed. It's this book in the 60s, sort of late 60s. Ralph Nader is a public advocate. He finds issues that the public should be concerned about and then advocates for them. Back in the 60s, you could do this kind of thing where he did a bunch of research about the safety of these vehicles. He wrote a book. He got on a bunch of media to talk about the book, and it raised a big public concern. This resulted in congressional hearings and so on, where he testified about the dangers of these cars. And as a result, there were regulatory changes to the vehicle industry. In particular, he got seatbelts installed in every car. It's a result of this book that now everyone has to ride a seatbelt, and seatbelts are common safety standard in all vehicles. Right before this book, before his public advocacy, there were no such safety standards. This is the kind of thing you used to be able to do back in the day when government worked. When a concerned citizen can take up a cause and then actually help pass legislation that protects the people, or it works in the interest of the people. And it worked. The government at the time, it wasn't ideal. In the 1950s, was not the best government in the world, of course. It's far from a politically perfect world. But it worked well enough that someone could do something like change the law. To give you a sense of how important these safety standards are, here are some graphs. Maybe sometimes might be a little bit shocking. Back in the 70s, at the peak, something like 54,000 people a year were dying of auto accidents. Currently, something around 36,000 people die of auto accidents. So you can see there's been a very clear downward trend, where 20,000 less people per year are dying of auto accidents. You see the upward trend pretty steady here. There's a gap in the 30s and 40s when all of the steel used for automobiles goes to the war effort. But then that sort of picks up back in the 50s and 60s. The sort of peak, that 1959 Malibu, is sort of over here in this peak. And this is also peak unsafety. And it's right in this period, in the 70s, that the Pinto is released. Since that time, things have gotten much more safe. And it's important to recognize that things have gotten much more safe. Fewer people are dying on the roads, despite the fact that way more people are driving. So there's way more cars on the road. There's way more people driving on the road, right? So billions and billions of hours of vehicle miles, more being driven today than were being driven in the 70s. But far, far fewer people are dying of auto accidents. And it's exactly for the reason that we saw in that last video, all these safety features and improvements. You might hear your sort of surly uncle at Thanksgiving complain about seatbelt laws and safety laws, and that cars used to be better back in the day. But as a matter of fact, cars killed a lot of people. The roads they're a meat grinder. 36,000 people a year still die of these accidents. 36,000 people, that's the size of a small town, being wiped out every year because we want to drive fast on the roads. This is a sort of social cost we're willing to pay. We're willing to pay 36,000 lives a year for the benefit of being able to drive. So cars are unsafe. There's this regulatory pressure. There's this public pressure on safety. There's also other kinds of pressures. There's financial pressures. So in the early 70s, there's this big gas crisis. It's the OPEC nations. They sort of band together and they start an oil embargo, and this results in a gas crisis where there's no gas anymore. There's all these pictures of long lines at the gas station in 1973. So gas prices are rocketing. People want fuel-efficient cars, and they're getting them from foreign competitors. So around this time, you see lots of these small compact and ultra-compact or sub vehicles that are extremely fuel-efficient, and they're very cheap. Especially the foreign auto manufacturers are able to make these. And these are putting pressure on U.S. automakers to make a car that can compete with the foreign competition and make it cheap enough that they can turn a profit. And this is what Ford builds the Pinto for. Right? So the Pinto comes in 1971, I believe. It's a hatchback car, which was starting to be the style. It was supposed to be cheap. It was supposed to be fuel efficient. It was supposed to be lightweight. It helps with fuel efficiency. Is that the Pinto would explode. Let me go ahead and show the video here. So this is 71 Impala crashing into the rear of a 72 Pinto. And it's at 35 miles an hour. The results you see here would happen as low as 20 miles an hour. So this is like residential driving speeds. So here comes the Impala into the back of the Pinto. at 35 miles an hour. At 35 miles an hour, you get this big fireball, and sometimes this would happen as low as 25 miles an hour. There's the trope in the movies about car movies in the 70s where the car explodes, like it flies off a cliff and explodes in the air or whatever. And the reason this trope exists is because cars actually did explode in the 70s. It wouldn't just explode, but it would crumple the sides, on the steel on the sides, so the doors would be difficult to open. They would get jammed. And so the passengers would just be burning alive. And in fact, this killed several people in exactly this kind of accident. So the reason for this fireball was because of a design feature of the Pinto. So the gas tank sat right in the back of the car, right above the rear wheel, and there was basically nothing protecting it from the back fender. So any direct impact, even at low speeds, would cause the fender to puncture the gas tank, spill gasoline everywhere, and then if there was any spark, which would likely happen from metal rubbing against metal, that gasoline would set on fire, and you get the big fireball we saw. Okay, so the cars exploded. Here's the problem. This is why this is a classic engineering ethics case. This is the standard engineering ethics case that you're going to see in almost every single engineering this and the Challenger explosion are very standard cases. And the reason this is a standard case is because Ford knew this was a problem. In fact, not only did Ford know that the Pintos would explode from low-speed collisions, but they even had a part designed and patented that would fix the problem. It was a small $11 part. It was basically a steel plate that you would install on the back of the gas tank, so that in the low collision you would hit the steel plate, and it would at least save the car from low-speed accidents that result in fireballs. That steel plate would cost $11. It would weigh a couple of pounds. $11 at the time, about $65 today. So a relatively cheap part. But even though they knew about this problem, even though they had the parts to fix it, they decided not to fix it. There are a couple of reasons for this. One reason was their goals for the car was to keep the car under 2,000 pounds and under $2,000. This was Lee Iacocca was the CEO of Ford, and his goal was under $2,000, under 2,000 pounds, and anything that would put it over that cost or that weight was ruled out, just not considered. Can't do it. So putting that metal plate on the back of the gas tank would have raised the cost a little bit. It would have raised the weight a little bit, and that was just not acceptable. Here's another problem. This is maybe even a more important problem. Because they wanted this car out as fast as possible, the manufacturing of the car went different than most cars. For most cars, you design a car, you build a prototype or a couple of prototypes, and then you test those prototypes thoroughly to make sure that the car works and that everything is safe and usable. And then once you have a prototype that you're happy with, then you machine the parts and you go into mass production. That whole process usually takes about 18 months. It usually takes about a couple of years. I want to say that the Pinto takes about 18 months. This is in the textbook, the details about how long it took. But Ford, Lee Iacocca wanted this car in consumers' hands as fast as possible, so they decided, instead of first running safety tests on the prototype and then going into production, they decided to do production and safety testing in parallel. And that means that by the time they discovered the part was faulty, that they discovered that the collisions would cause these fireballs. By the time they discovered this, there were already 11 million cars that had been built, and then redoing all of these cars would have been a huge cost. And it was a cost that the company was not willing to shoulder. Lee Iacocca's catchphrase at the time was that safety doesn't sell. Right? It was there was this sort of backlash from the automotive industry against the Ralph Nader safety concerns. That Lee Iacocca was like, okay, well, they're unsafe, but look, the cars, they want these cars, especially the subcompact cars, they want them because they're cheap and they're efficient. They don't want these cars, no one's buying these cars because they think that they're super safe. and if you make them more safe, it's going to cost too much for the people who want the cars to afford them. So if you want these cars to sell, if you want to run a business, you got to keep these cars cheap and light, and that means not put on the safety feature. Safety, by the way, is the attendance word for this lesson. You can put safety as the Friday lecture word to get attendance credit for this week. So Ford knew this was a problem, and Ford decided to put the car on the road anyway. And it killed a bunch of people. And the Pinto comes out in 1971. In 1977, Mark Dowie, who's a reporter for Mother Jones is a investigative journalism magazine, still in publication. Mark Dowie does this expose where he investigates a bunch of people at Ford and then finds this memo. The memo is going around where Ford actually does a calculation where they decide not to replace the car. And here's the calculation they do. This graphic is actually from the Dennis Droya piece we'll be reading next week. But this is a calculation that's reported by Mark Dowie in the 1977 article. And here's the calculation. So Ford first estimates this $11 part, and there's however many vehicles on the road, 11 million vehicles on the road or whatever. So at $11 per vehicle, so there's 12 million vehicles, 12.5 million vehicles on the road, and $11 per part to fix each of those vehicles would result in $137 million total to fix the problem with the Pinto. $137 million, it's a lot of money. And then they compare that to, so if you fix all the vehicles with this $11 part, it would cost $137 million. If instead of fixing the part, you just accept the people are going to die, and you calculate instead how much it would cost to settle in court all of these deaths and burn injuries. So Ford estimates that about 180 people would die, and it would cost about $200,000 per death in court as a legal cost. Plus about 180 people would get burned but wouldn't die, and that would be about $67,000. And they estimated that about 2,100 cars would get burned, and that they would pay about $700 in lawsuits, in addition to these death and injury settlements. And that when you add that all up together, it's about $50 million, $49.5 million. So if we fix the part, it would be $137 million. If we let a bunch of people die and then pay off their families, it would be about $50 million. 137 is a lot more than $50 million. So Ford, on the basis of this calculation, decide that they're not going to fix the part. That safety doesn't sell, that it's not financially viable to fix the part. Even though it would save lives, it's not in their financial interest to do so. And because it's the financial interest that motivates them most, they decide not to fix the part. So in the article, Mark Dowie interviews some engineers. One of the engineers says that the company is run by salesmen, not engineers, so priority is styling, not safety. Right? You want to have a big rear trunk. You don't want to impede in the size of that trunk. Right? You don't want to impede on the weight of the car, that kind of stuff. Mark Dowie writes, this cost-benefit analysis argued that Ford should not make an $11 improvement that would prevent 180 fiery deaths a year. The memo argues that there is no financial benefit in complying with a proposed safety standard that would admittedly result in fewer auto fires, fewer burn deaths, and fewer burn injuries. Right? So they knew that they would save lives by installing this part, but because it wasn't financially viable, they decided against it. Some questions about the Ford case. So we're actually going to be the Ford case, the Pinto case, quite a lot. You can't see it on the website, but this week we're doing just introducing the Pinto. Next week we're going to talk about Dennis Droya. Dennis Droya was the field recall coordinator at Ford during the 70s, during the Pinto years. Basically, it was his responsibility to issue a recall if they were going to do it at all. And he decided against it. In the 90s, he writes this article, Pinto Fires and Personal Ethics, where he talks about his decision, why he made the decision that he did. And so next week we'll look at Dennis Joya's perspective from being the person whose job it was to make this decision, right? Why did he make this decision? And then in lesson 5, we're going to talk about whistleblowing. So a couple of articles that we'll read about people who consider the question of whether Ford's engineers should have blown a whistle on the Pinto, or should they have blown the whistle or shouldn't they? And we'll have one article that says they should have blown the whistle and another one that says they shouldn't have. And that'll be in lesson 5. This again is on the Pinto case. So we're going to be spending the next few weeks on the Pinto case. This week, learn what happened, sort of get comfortable with the Pinto case, and think about how you feel about it. Think about how you feel about Ford's decision, about Ford's priorities. Right, what factors were they taking into account in making this decision? Were they the appropriate factors to be considering? Right, what other things should they have been considering in their decision making? Ford's decision a utilitarian decision? It seems like it's a consequentialist decision. It seems like they were giving a very clear cost-benefit analysis. But how would a utilitarian have decided this case differently? And for what reasons? Do some research. Find out what the actual consequences of Ford's actions were. How many people died? Right? How much did they have to pay out in lawsuits? Did they actually make the right decision? I'll tell you the following 2 things. First, that Ford was sued. So Mark Dowie puts out the Pinto Madness article in 1977. This results in, again, a public outcry, and eventually Ford is sued for not just negligence, but they're sued for wrongful killing. And this is the first time that a corporation is brought up on trial on manslaughter, on killing someone. But Ford is eventually found not guilty of killing people, of negligence. So they were brought up on charges, and they were eventually found not guilty. Later in the semester, we're going to go over the BP oil spill, and in that case, BP was also brought up on charges of killing, negligence that resulted in death, and then they were found guilty of it, and they had to face pretty steep consequences. Ford was found not guilty of the negligence in this case. They were found guilty in civil lawsuits, but do some research, find out what penalties Ford actually faced as a result of their decision here, and see if you think it was worth it. Evaluate Ford's decision making. Also evaluate Lee Iacocca's catchphrase that safety doesn't sell. How do you feel about this catchphrase? How does this catchphrase compare with, for instance, the NSPE Code of Ethics that we introduced last week? Right? Is this an ethical position? Can you ethically hold this position? All right, that's the core of the lesson. I have a couple of optional readings I just want to throw up here. One is from Peter Singer. I mentioned a quote from Famine, Affluence, Morality about the problem of ethical distance. In this article, Singer is arguing that we ought to be a lot more generous with our goods than we are. That in fact, it's unethical to keep a lot of these things for ourselves. So Singer gives this kind of example that I mentioned before. Imagine that I see a little kid drowning in a pool, a little kiddie pool that's right next to me. So a little kiddie pool on the sidewalk, I'm standing right next to it, and there's like a 3-year-old in the pool, and they're sort of playing around, and then they start drowning. You can drown in very little water, and I see this kid drowning. They're sort of struggling, they're flailing around. I see the kid drowning, and I could save them. But if I saved them, then I would get my shoes wet, and my shoes are these suede shoes that I really like, very fancy, very expensive shoes, and I reason that it's not worth sacrificing my shoes, which, I really like these shoes. They're my favorite shoes, and I don't want to get my shoes wet. If they get wet, they'll be completely ruined. And so I decide not to save the kid for the shoes. Now, most people would see my decision here as being unethical. Most people would see it as being a sort of extreme violation of ethics, that I let the kid drown in order to save shoes, that those shoes aren't worth it, that I should be willing to sacrifice shoes, even if they're really expensive shoes, in order to save a life, that a life is worth much more than shoes. And Singer says, yeah, okay, that's the case. Most people would agree with that. But Singer then says, but look, there's people overseas in poverty-stricken countries, maybe from famine or from war, in a G camp, and they need support also. maybe they're in just as dire circumstances as the child that's drowning. Maybe their life isn't just as much of a threat. And moreover, that you could help those people by making a small sacrifice, just like you could save the child by sacrificing your shoes. If you gave $100 a month to a famine relief effort or a refugee assistance effort, then you might be saving people who's, you might be feeding a family who wouldn't have that food otherwise, who might starve otherwise. And just because they're far away, right, this is problem distance, just because they're far away doesn't mean that they deserve any less help, right? So if you think that you should be willing to make a great sacrifice for someone drowning right next to you, then you should also be willing to make that same great sacrifice for people overseas. But then Singer says, but this is not what we do. We instead spend our goods on luxuries for ourselves, luxuries that we don't need. So, for instance, if you want to buy that PlayStation 4 and the newest game, every week or whatever, that's $60 for that game. That same $60, when you spend $60 on that game, maybe you play it for a few days, 40 or 50 hours worth of pleasure, and then you just put that game on the shelf and never play it again. But that same $60 could go to feed a family for a week, a family of 4 for a week, right? And the idea that you're more willing to spend that luxury item on yourself for this resource that you don't really need, instead of trying to help this family overseas, is unethical, right? That you're just merely acting selfishly by spending it on yourself. Singer is not saying that you shouldn't ever do anything for yourself, but that we do a lot more than we need to do for ourselves, and that when you consider how those resources could be put to better use in the interest of serving people who actually need it, that this starts to look unjustified. Right? It doesn't matter that you earned that money. What matters is that people, don't die of starvation, right? That don't die of curable medical diseases, right? If all that's required is you giving this money, and instead, in order to save lives, and instead you spend it on video games, that's Singer's point is that that's just as bad as letting that child die in the kiddie pool right next to you. But we don't see it because it's far away. Singer's also not arguing that you should put yourself in poverty in order to help others, right? You should make sure that you're taken care of as well, but just he's arguing against these excessive luxuries. So one feature of consequentialism is that it might require a great sacrifice from you. Doing what's best, doing what's in the general interest or for the general happiness, might mean going against your own interests, sometimes quite substantially. And sometimes you have to sacrifice splurging on yourself for the sake of others. At least that's what consequentialists and utilitarians like Peter Singer argue. The last example I want to give is another consequentialist sort of consideration is about tobacco executives, about the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry has a bunch of machinery that requires employing engineers. So engineers sometimes go to work for the tobacco industry, making machines that kill lots of people every year. I didn't put this on the slide, but how many people die of smoking-related illnesses? If you remember, about 36,000 people die of vehicle deaths every year, vehicle accidents every year. At its peak, it was something around like 56,000 people a year dying of vehicle accidents. So with that in mind, consider that cigarette smoke causes about 480,000 deaths per year in the United States. About 41,000 from secondhand smoke. 480,000 deaths per year. That's 500,000 people a year die of smoking-related illnesses. Lung cancer is almost exclusively a smoker's disease. That's 1 in 5 deaths annually. 1,300 people die every day from smoking-related illnesses. 480,000 deaths. That's 10 times as many people as are killed in vehicle accidents. It's 20 times as many people as killed. 1.5 times as many people. 15 times. That's like a major city every year being wiped out. And again, there are engineers who help build the machines that contribute to these people dying. Now, a lot of people will say, well, smoking, people who smoke, they know that they're doing something that's dangerous. They know that it's unhealthy, and they're making the choice to do it anyway. That's partially true. It's also true that smoking is addictive, and that cigarettes are designed to maximize addictive potential, so that people are hooked on the things, and it makes them very hard for them to not smoke. Right? So to say that it's free choice when it's an addictive substance is a little bit misleading. Moreover, the tobacco industry has for decades published just out-and-out lies about the health consequences of tobacco. In fact, for a long time, tobacco industry took out ads that suggested that, in fact, doctors would prescribe cigarettes, that some cigarettes were healthier than others, that some cigarettes are better for smoking, and that they might even be suggested by your doctor to smoke. Right? So the idea that we believe now that cigarettes are unhealthy, this is something that was vigorously fought against by the tobacco industry. For a long time, they argued that, in fact, tobacco was healthy, was doctor recommended. It wasn't until the 80s that that it became very clear that there were negative health consequences to smoking, and that the addictive nature of smoking made it difficult to stop from smoking. Right. So to say that it's people's choice is sort of misleading. And what it's really doing when they say that it's people's choice is that they they're getting rid of the responsibility themselves. Look, it's not my fault if other people are choosing to smoke. All I'm doing is making a good product. If people choose to buy it, it's their fault, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe it's your fault for building a bunch of, for producing a bunch of cancer sticks that will kill a bunch of people. 480,000 people a year, 500,000 people a year from these cigarettes. Right? You don't have to make the cigarettes. Right? We don't have to allow people to smoke cigarettes. People like it, but that doesn't mean that it's good for them. Right? So what responsibility do we have as a country to make sure that people are protected from these kinds of addictive, deadly products? Right. And what responsibility do you have as an engineer if you're working for companies that make these kinds of deadly but profitable products? The tobacco industry is maybe an easier case. I think the harder case is the military industrial complex, right? The weapons manufacturing industry, making weapons for one of the major weapons manufacturers, making jets and rockets and cruisers and so on for military contractors. These are high-paying, very they would be very good jobs. Most engineers would very much like a job in the aviation industry or in the military contracting industry. They're good jobs. They will pay well. You have lots of benefits. But they also make machines that kill people, right? Thousands or millions of people a year. Right? And how comfortable are you going to be working for a company that causes this kind of destruction? I have, I guess, a lot more to say about this, but I think I'm going to let you go ahead and think about what you want to say. There's lots of material. I think I've been talking long enough. Thank you very much, everyone. Good luck with your posts and quizzes. I will talk to you next week.